Good evening and welcome back. Settle in, lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight, only listen. And let the world grow quiet around you. It is the 6th of September, 1522, and a ship is coming up the river to Seville that the people on the banks can hardly believe is afloat. Her sails are patched on patches, her seams weep at every roll. Her pumps have been worked, hand over blistered hand, every day for months. 80 men bring her in, 18 of about 270 who sailed. They are skeletons in rags, and when they stagger ashore, the first thing they do is walk barefoot through the city, each man carrying a lit candle to give thanks at the shrines of a god they have several times doubted was watching. 3 years earlier, 5 ships went out under the proudest banner in Spain. This is the one that came back. The first ship and the first handful of human beings ever to go around the world. Behind that homecoming lies the hardest voyage in this whole age of hard voyages. Mutiny and marooning, a hidden strait at the bottom of a continent, an ocean so wide it starved them, and a captain general of genius who lies dead, face down in the surf of an island he had never heard of 2 years before. This is the story of Ferdinand Magellan, of Juan Sebastian Elcano, and of the first circumnavigation of the earth. Ferdinand Magellan was a Portuguese soldier of the India fleets, one of thousands, and by his late 30s he had the scars and the grievances to show for it, and not much else. He had gone east in the great armadas that followed da Gama, and spent nearly a decade in the empire's rough founding, wounded at sea off India, present at the fall of Malacca in 1511, when Portugal seized the crossroads of the eastern trade. From Malacca, his closest friend, Francisco Serrano, had sailed on with the first Portuguese ships to reach the true Spice Islands, the Moluccas, the tiny volcanic specks where, alone on earth, the clove tree grew. And there Serrano had simply stayed, gone half native as advisor to a sultan, writing Magellan letters that glowed like treasure maps. "I have found here a new world," he wrote, "richer and greater than that of Vasco da Gama. Keep the letters in mind, whole fates hang on them." To understand what those letters promise, remember the arithmetic of spice. Cloves grew then on 5 small volcanic islands and nowhere else on earth. Nutmeg on a handful more. A sack bought on those beaches for a knife, and some cloth multiplied its price 100-fold by the time it reached a European apothecary, where cloves sold gram against gram within sight of gold. A single good cargo could pay for a fleet and enrich a king. That was the sum underneath this entire series. The reason crowns kept pouring ships into the ocean. And nowhere did it burn brighter than in the mind of a passed-over soldier who knew from his friend's own hand exactly where the trees stood. Home from the east, Magellan served in Morocco, where a lance took him in the knee and left him with a limp for life, and where an accusation of petty corruption, later dropped, left a stain on his name that he could never quite scrub off with his king. When he went to court to ask, as veterans did, for a rise in his tiny pension, King Manuel refused him, twice, the chroniclers say, and coldly. And when Magellan asked whether the king would object if he offered his services elsewhere, Manuel replied, in effect, that he could do as he pleased, and by one account declined even to give him his hand to kiss. It was the costliest snub in the history of Portugal, because what the limping veteran took elsewhere was an idea built from his friend's letters and the age's newest geography. Everyone now understood that Columbus's lands were not Asia but a barrier, a wall of continent between Europe and the Spice Islands. But every wall, a soldier knows, has a gate. Somewhere down that long American coastline there must be a strait through to the ocean beyond. El Paso, the passage. And beyond it, perhaps only a modest sail further, the Moluccas. And here the lawyers leaned in beside the sailors. By the Treaty of Tordesillas, the world was split between Spain and Portugal along a line in the Atlantic. But a line drawn around a globe comes out the other side. If the Spice Islands lay far enough east, they lay in Spain's half of the world. The clove trade, lawfully, might belong to Castile, if a Spanish fleet could reach its sailing west without ever touching Portugal's sea road. So in 1517, Magellan crossed the border with his charts, his globe, his enslaved Malaccan servant Enrique, bought in the east years before, and about whom this story has much more to say, and offered Spain the world, turned the other way. The young King Charles, 18 years old and hungry for glory his grandparents Columbus had promised, said yes. Manuel of Portugal, hearing of it, moved from indifference to fury and set his agents in Seville to wreck the project by any means available. They very nearly managed it. The 2 years of preparation in Seville were a war before the war. Magellan's partner in the scheme, the astronomer Rui Falero, brilliant, obsessive, and by most accounts more than half mad, had supplied the crucial, and largely wrong, calculations placing the Spice Islands in Spain's half of the globe. He was eased off the expedition before it sailed, raged at the betrayal, and ended his days in confinement. Around the fitting out swirled Portuguese agents reporting every rivet to Lisbon, Spanish officials starving the foreigner of funds and trust, and the Casa de Contratacion's clerks itemizing everything from 90 dozen fish hooks to the 20,000 hawk bells destined for beach diplomacy. The paperwork survives. It is the last completely documented moment of the voyage. After Seville, the story belongs to the survivors. The Armada de Molucca, when it finally cleared the bar at San Lucar on the 20th of September 1519, was 5 ships and about 270 men, and it was a powder keg with a fuse already lit. The ships were the Trinidad, Magellan's flagship, the San Antonio the largest, carrying the lion's share of the stores, the Concepcion, the Victoria, remember her, and the little Santiago. The crews were a babel swept from the docks of Europe, Castilians and Basques, Portuguese and Genoese, Greeks, Flemings, a German gunner, a French barber, and one supernumerary who matters to this story more than any officer, a young Italian gentleman tourist named Antonio Pigafetta, who had talked his way aboard for the adventure, and whose journal, curious, humane, omnivorous, is the reason we can tell these night's events at all. He would prove one of the great travel writers of all time and one of the great survivors. The trouble was built into the wardroom. The Castilian captains, proud men with court connections, chief among them Juan de Cartagena, who held a royal appointment as the fleet's inspector, despised taking orders from a Portuguese defector who kept his plans locked in his chest and his counsel behind his teeth. Magellan, secretive by nature and by necessity, told no one, perhaps not even himself, in writing, exactly where his strait was supposed to be. Before the fleet even crossed the Atlantic, Cartagena challenged his authority on deck. Magellan had him seized by the collar and arrested, a scene the other captains did not forget or forgive. The fleet's troubles had begun, in fact, before the anchors ever came up. In the warehouses, the provisioning had passed through hands that Portugal's agents and Seville's contractors had both touched, and somewhere between invoice and hold, the fleet's stores had been quietly bled. Casks short-filled, biscuit underweighed, records adjusted. Magellan sailed, believing he carried provisions for 2 years. He carried much less, and the discovery would come, as such discoveries do, at the worst possible longitude. Whether it was fraud, sabotage, or the ordinary corruption of dockyards, no one ever proved. But half the hunger in this story was loaded aboard, invisible in Seville. They watered at Rio de Janeiro. 13 easy days among the generous Guarani, trading fish hooks for pineapples and knives for fowls. A last taste of plenty that men would dream about for the next 2 years. And then began the real work. Probing down the coast of South America, testing every opening. The great estuary of the River Plate swallowed weeks. It was fresh water, a river's mouth, not a strait. The coast bent on, southward and colder. The men's Mediterranean clothes grew thin against Antarctic winds. Penguins, strange black geese, Pigafetta called them, crowded shores that offered less and less. By late March 1520, with the southern winter closing in, Magellan put the fleet into a bleak, sheltered bay he named Port San Julián, cut the bread ration, and announced they would winter there at the ends of the earth and go on searching in the spring. That was the spark. On Easter night, the fuse burned down. The mutiny of San Julián was no drunken scuffle. It was a coup by 3 of the fleet's 5 captains, carried out in the dark with boarding parties and drawn swords. By morning, Cartagena and his allies held 3 ships, including the vital San Antonio, and sent Magellan a message dressed as negotiation. Accept the captain's counsel, turn the fleet towards sense, and all would be well. What followed showed exactly why a king had trusted this particular hard, silent man with half the world. Magellan answered the message politely and used the mutineers' own boat to smuggle a loyal officer and a handful of men aboard the Victoria, where, in a rush of seconds, the mutinous Captain Mendoza was struck down and killed, and the ship retaken. That made the odds 3-2. When the San Antonio tried to slip to sea that night, she found the loyal ships waiting at the bay's mouth, took a broadside, and surrendered almost without a fight. By the second morning it was over. The reckoning was medieval, and Magellan meant it to be remembered. Quesada, the captain who had shed blood, was beheaded. His own servant compelled to strike the blow in exchange for his life. Mendoza's corpse was quartered alongside. Dozens of implicated men were sentenced to death and then reprieved to hard labour at the pumps. The fleet could not spare their hands. And Cartagena, the royal inspector, too connected to execute, was sentenced to be left behind. When the fleet finally sailed, he and a conspiring priest were set ashore on that empty coast with wine and biscuit, and the ships stood out to sea. They were never heard of again. Of everything in this story, that marooning, slower and quieter than any execution, may sit heaviest. The winter gave them one wonder and one loss. The wonder came walking down the beach. The people of that coast, the Tehuelche, whom the Europeans, themselves stunted by shipboard rations, described as giants, so tall that the sailors reached only their waists. Pigafetta, characteristically, learned words of their language and recorded their dances and their medicines. Magellan, in the age's ugliest reflex, lured two aboard in leg irons to bring home as specimens. Both died on the voyage. The land kept a version of the name the sailors gave those people, Patagonia. The loss was the little Santiago, wrecked in a storm while scouting south. Her crew survived, two of them walking overland through the snow for help, and the fleet was four. San Julián itself would collect one more famous ghost, and the coincidence is worth a night thought. 58 years later, almost to the season, the next man to attempt the strait, Francis Drake, put into the very same desolate harbour to winter, found the weathered timbers of Magellan's gibbet still standing on the shore. And there tried and executed a gentleman conspirator of his own, Thomas Doughty, for plotting against his command. 2 expeditions, 2 generations, 2 mutinies, 1 grey beach at the bottom of the world. Some harbours seem to demand the same scene from everyone who anchors in them. The men of the age noticed it too, and sailed past San Julián, ever after with a certain respect. And in October, with spring, they found it. A gap in the coast at 52 degrees south, salt water, deep water, tides, winding westward between black cliffs and white mountains, into the heart of the land. Magellan named it for the day, the Strait of All Saints. The world would name it for him. The strait was a maze, 350 miles of channels, false bays, willy-war squalls and doubling passages, snow mountains hanging over black water, and it took the fleet 38 days of feeling and sounding to thread it. To the south, night after night, the crews watched unexplained fires burning on a vast dark shore and gave the land the name it still carries, Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. Halfway through, the fleet became 3. The San Antonio, the storeship, the fleet's larder, captained now by men with no appetite left for glory, turned in the channels, clapped her pilot in irons and ran for home. She reached Spain months later, her officers saving themselves by blackening Magellan's name at court. Her desertion was worse than any storm. It took with her the greater part of the expedition's food, and everyone knew it. The council of the remaining ships voted on the record to go on. One pilot noted quietly that they now had provisions for 3 months. The ocean ahead, though no man alive knew it, would demand nearly 4. The deserters, for the record, made history of their own in reverse. The San Antonio's pilot, Esteban Gomez, a capable, jealous man who had wanted the fleet command himself, carried her home with a cargo of grievances and one of the giant men of Patagonia, kidnapped as evidence, who died unnamed in the Atlantic heat. The desertion brought Gomes no glory, and in time an expedition of his own to seek a passage in the opposite direction, along the coasts of what are now New England and Nova Scotia, where no strait was either. The age had a way of making even its betrayals explore something. On the 28th of November 1520, the Trinidad, Conception and Victoria passed the last capes and felt the long swell of an unknown ocean lift their bows. The Iron Captain General Pigafetta records wept for joy. The water stretched ahead, blue and mild, and Magellan gave it the name it has kept ever since, and never quite deserved, Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. No one on earth, not Magellan, not the map makers, not the ancients he trusted, had any conception of what they had just entered. The Pacific is a third of the planet. All the land on Earth could be dropped into it and drowned. Magellan expected the Spice Islands within days, a few weeks at the outside. The crossing took 98 days, and by cruel perfect bad luck, their course threaded the emptiest water of the greatest ocean, missing every inhabited island, the whole scattered universe of Polynesia, except 2 barren specks that offered neither anchor nor food. They did strike land twice in all that immensity. 2 waterless, uninhabited specks, where the boats found sharks and seabirds and nothing a starving man could carry away. The charts called them afterward the Unfortunate Islands, which is the age's flat way of recording despair. To sight land at last, after weeks of empty horizon, and find that even the land is empty, they filled what water they could from rain and sailed on. Pigafetta's account of those months is the most famous passage of starvation in the sea's whole literature, and it needs no dressing up. The biscuit gave out first as bread and lingered as a powder of crumbs, worms and the fouling of rats. The water yellowed and stank. The crews ate ox hides that chafed the mainyard, towing them days in the sea to soften, then grilling them over embers. They ate sawdust. They hunted the rats through the holes and sold them to one another for half a ducat apiece. And the sellers, Pigafetta notes, could not catch enough. Scurvy did its slow work, gums swelling over teeth until men could not eat at all. 19 dead by the ordinary count, the living too weak to commit the dead properly to the sea. And through it all, this is the detail that stays. The trade wind held fair and gentle, the sky stayed blue, and the peaceful sea carried the dying fleet sweetly west, day after beautiful, murderous day. One wonder the starving men still had eyes for: the boats of the islanders, the proas of the Marianas, slim double-enders with a single outrigger and a triangular sail, able to reverse direction without turning, sailed circles around the lumbering naus, skimming, Pigafetta marvelled, like dolphins between the waves. Europeans would keep writing home about those boats for 3 centuries. They were, by a wide margin, the fastest sailing craft on Earth. The fleet that had just crossed the greatest ocean was being escorted in by the descendants of the sailors who had crossed it first, 1,000 years earlier, without a compass, in vessels Europe still could not match for speed. On the 6th of March, 1521, a lookout too weak to shout properly raised islands, with sails moving among them, the flying proas of Guam and people and food. The meeting, after such a deliverance, went the way of the age. The Chamorro Islanders, whose sea customs held useful property loosely, swarmed the ships and helped themselves. A skiff, iron, whatever was loose. The starving Spaniards answered next day with crossbows and burned houses to recover a boat. Magellan named the islands for thieves, and the name, the Ladrones, libelled a generous people for centuries. Both sides were obeying their own laws. Only one side had guns and named things. 10 days later, they raised a greener, gentler archipelago, the islands that would one day be called the Philippines. And there this voyage produced its quietest miracle, the one historians still turn over like a coin. Magellan's slave Enrique, seized at Malacca a decade before, carried to Lisbon, to Morocco, to Spain, and now westward around the planet, was brought on deck as islanders paddled out to trade. He called to them in Malay, and they answered him, understood him. After a world of strange coasts and sign language, a man on this deck had sailed all the way back into the sound of his own tongue. Whether Enrique's cradle was here or in Sumatra, the meaning stood, the circle was closing. And if his home was truly these islands, then the first human being ever to circle the earth was not a captain and not a Spaniard, but a Malay slave, completing in chains of service the greatest journey in history. Pigafetta, as ever, was busy falling in love with the world while it happened. He filled pages with Visayan words, weighed bananas and coconuts in wonder, recorded the gold-hilted daggers, the tattoos, the palm wine drunk through reeds, the courtesies of chiefs who sealed friendship by exchanging drops of blood. When the Raja's principal wife came to be baptized, a grave, beautiful woman, he says, she was given a small carved image of the Christ child. 44 years later, Spanish soldiers returning to Cebu would find the same Santo Niño preserved in a village house, and it stands enshrined in Cebu's basilica today. The oldest Christian relic in the Philippines, a survivor, like the story itself, of everything that followed. The friendships, while they lasted, were sealed in the island's own solemn form. The blood compact, arms nicked, the drops mingled in wine and drunk by both parties. Kasi brotherhood between a Raja and a Captain General. And on Easter Sunday, on a small island, the source's name Mazawa. Its identification argued over by Philippine historians to this day. The fleet's priest said Mass ashore, the first by tradition on Philippine soil, planted with the cross on the highest hill. 5 centuries later, that Mass is a national anniversary. The argument about which island hosted it is conducted with footnotes and genuine passion. Few countries can date their own founding conversation so precisely, or contest its street address so warmly. Through Enrique's mouth, everything suddenly moved fast, too fast. Alliances, feasts, the Raja of Cebu, Humabon, weighing these strange armed guests and their obvious usefulness. Mass baptisms by the 100 as Magellan, veteran of crusading Portugal, threw himself into the making of Christians with a convert's fire that alarmed his own officers. The burning of one village that declined. The Captain General had crossed the worst ocean on earth by patience and iron method. Ashore, among island politics he had only just met, both deserted him at once. On the little island of Mactan, across the channel from Cebu, a chief named Lapu-Lapu refused tribute, refused baptism, refused Humabon's overlordship. And Magellan decided, against every plea, to make an example in person. He would take a handful of men, he announced, and Humabon's warriors would stand off in their boats and merely watch how Spaniards fought. Before dawn on the 27th of April, 1521, some 49 armoured men waded toward Mactan's shore. The coral flats kept the boats and their guns far out, against a force Pigafetta guessed at 1,500. The islanders, quick studies, aimed low at the unarmoured legs. The bombardment from the boats fell short. The burned huts enraged rather than frightened, and the retreat across the flats became a fight in the water, with a rearguard of a few men around a limping Captain General who was recognised, swarmed, wounded in the arm, wounded in the leg, and brought down, face first, in the shallows. Pigafetta, wounded beside him, wrote the epitaph the official reports never managed. They killed our mirror, our light, our comfort, and our true guide. On Mactan today, Lapu-Lapu stands in bronze, the first Filipino to turn back a European empire. Seen from that beach, this scene reads not as tragedy, but as defence of home. And both readings are true at once, and the sea adds its own dry footnote. The victors kept the body. Spain's offers of ransom were refused. And the first Captain General to span the globe's two great oceans has no grave. Anyone can visit. One detail of the massacre's aftermath refuses to be forgotten. The fleet's senior surviving officer, João Serrão, kinsman of that Francisco whose letters had started everything, was dragged to the shore by the Cebuanos and displayed to the ships, bound and bleeding, begging his comrades to ransom him. The ships, fearing treachery or beyond caring, weighed anchor instead. Pigafetta, who records everything, records the men's shame at the sails filling while Serrão still called across the water. The age's chronicles are full of battles. It is the small abandonments that read coldest. The unravelling was swift and bitter. Enrique, whom Magellan's will freed upon his death, a freedom the surviving officers refused to honour, went ashore at Cebu, and days later, at a feast of reconciliation, Humabon's men massacred most of the fleet's remaining leadership. Whether Enrique had a hand in turning his master's ally, the sources whisper and cannot prove. He vanishes from history there, at the feast's edge. Home perhaps, and free at last, one way or the other. The survivors, too few for 3 ships, burned the Concepcion in the strait and fled. The remnants' arithmetic forced one more farewell before the Spice Islands. At Bohol, with perhaps 150 men left to work 3 ships, the survivors emptied the Concepcion of everything useful and burned her to the waterline, partly for want of hands, partly so no enemy would have her. 3 of the 5 ships were gone now. 1 wrecked scouting, 1 deserted home, 1 burned by her own crew in a strange archipelago. And the men who watched her flames from the other 2 decks had crossed the widest ocean on earth to reach a place where their fleet was worth more as firewood and spare cordage than as ships. The age's ledgers are always like this, close up, glory in the summary line and salvage in the entries. What remained was a fugitive remnant with no leader, half a crew and half the world still to cross. And out of that remnant rose the voyage's unlikely second hero, Juan Sebastian Elcano, a Basque master who had once sailed with the mutineers at San Julián and been pardoned to the pumps. Months of wandering brought the 2 last ships, at long last, to the goal itself, the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, where the air off the volcanoes smelled of cloves, and Serrão's Sultanate of Tidore filled their holds at last with the cargo the whole enterprise had been mortgaged for. Serrão himself, the friend whose letters had launched the fleet, was months dead, poisoned it was said in island intrigues, missing the reunion by a season. The worn-out Trinidad, leaken beyond repair, stayed for refit and tried to return east across the Pacific. The ocean drove her back and Portugal took her and her crew, few of whom ever saw home. Elcano in the Victoria chose the other madness, west onward around, through Portugal's own ocean, without touching Portugal's ports, without charts he could trust in a ship already dying. He crossed the Indian Ocean, doubled the Cape of Good Hope against weeks of storm, and then sailed 20 weeks without a landfall up the whole Atlantic, while hunger killed a man every few days, and the crew, given the choice between Portuguese prisons and probable death at sea, voted for the sea. At the Cape Verde Islands, desperate for food and water, they bluffed, a Spanish ship astray from the Americas, nothing more. And the ruse bought 2 boatloads of rice before a slip of the tongue betrayed them, and 13 shipmates were seized on the beach as the Victoria cut and ran. It was there, at Cape Verde, that the survivors made the voyage's last discovery, with a calendar. Ashore it was Thursday. Aboard, by a log kept faithfully every single day for 3 years, it was Wednesday. They had lost a day, and no error could be found because there was none. Sailing forever westward with the sun, they had lived one fewer sunrise than the world they left. The globe itself had signed their logbook. Learned Europe marvelled. The travellers had brought home, along with the cloves, the first hard proof written on human bodies that the earth turns. And so, to the river at Seville, where we began, 18 men and a ghost ship, 3 years out, the first circle ever closed around the earth. The cloves in her hold, by the accountant's reckoning, roughly paid for the loss of 4 ships and 250 men. Such was the price of Pepper's rivals. The emperor gave Elcano a coat of arms, a globe belted with the motto Primus circumdedisti me, you first encircled me. Pigafetta, who survived everything, wrote the book that made the voyage immortal and gave its last loyal word not to the emperor nor to Elcano, whom he pointedly declined to praise, but to the fallen Captain General at Mactan. Their first act ashore was neither report nor celebration. The day after the Victoria walked to her berth, the 18, gaunt, in whatever clothes 3 years had left them, walked barefoot through Seville in their shirts, each man carrying a lit taper, in procession to the shrine of Santa Maria de la Victoria, the very church where Magellan had received the fleet's royal standard 3 years before, and then on to a second shrine to keep the vows they had made mid-ocean in the nights they expected to die. Seville watched them pass in silence. It is the truest image of the whole story. Not the globe on a coat of arms, but 18 barefoot men with candles, paying a debt to the ship's namesake, the only one of 5 ships whose name, Victory, the voyage had actually earned. And the great prize itself, the islands all those men had died reaching, were settled in the end by accountants. Nobody in the 1520s could actually measure longitude well enough to say whose half of the world the Moluccas sat in. So in 1529, at Zaragoza, the emperor, needing money for his European wars, simply sold Spain's claim to Portugal for 350,000 gold ducats, sight unseen, argument unresolved. Modern measurement shows the islands had been on Portugal's side of the line all along. 5 ships, 4 years, and the better part of 300 lives spent disputing a boundary no instrument on earth could yet find, and settled at last with a receipt. As for Elcano, the sea gave him 4 years of fame and then presented its bill. He sailed again in 1525 as chief pilot of a grand second armada bound for the Moluccas by Magellan's own strait. The Pacific, unimpressed by precedent, starved that fleet too. And somewhere in its vast middle, in the summer of 1526, Juan Sebastian Elcano died of scurvy and was given to the ocean he had been first to cross both ways. The globe on his coat of arms had circled him back. Even the numbers of the homecoming have their poetry. The Victoria landed some 26 tons of cloves, enough once sold to cover the entire expedition's losses and turn a modest profit on the wreck of 5 ships and 250 lives. The emperor's accountants, one imagines, filed it as a success. The ship herself was patched, sold, and kept working the Atlantic like any tramp, until years later, on an ordinary run from the Indies, she went missing with all hands. No wreck was ever found. The first vessel to circle the earth lies somewhere unmarked beneath the ocean she conquered, which is either an injustice or the only fitting harbour, depending on the hour of night you consider it. Magellan's paradox is a gentle one to fall asleep on. He never meant to sail around the world, only out to the Spice Islands and home the same way. The circle was forced on the survivors by catastrophe. He died halfway in the surf of a quarrel that was never his. And yet the strait keeps his name, and the clouds of stars he logged in southern skies are the Magellanic Clouds to this day. The ocean he named Pacific keeps his hopeful word for it. And when we say casually that someone has circumnavigated anything, we are spending coin his voyage minted. The earth was measured at last, not by astronomers, but by ordinary hungry men in a leaking ship, counting their bread. One great ocean in this story still lies almost untouched, the one the Victoria fled across in 98 starving days, its 10,000 islands unmapped, its far rim unknown. It would wait 2.5 more centuries for its patient, methodical master, a farm boy from Yorkshire with a knack for charts and a ship called Endeavour. Captain James Cook is where we end this series when next we meet. That is where we will leave it tonight. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again.